Piuraha, hiuduna kada harmito, ada harma angsuanga, amahwa. Hifsumik tegu tsakado dunga, piurimik atara, tegu hiutakaya, Robert E. Peary II. Ataktauna adinaiha hok narungikado do, kang huti hahamangitsunga.
This is a story that takes place in a time when the world remained unexplored and maps were still full of blank spaces. A story about the price that was paid for one man's dream to reach his goal, the North Pole. Already as a teenager, Peary decided to become a polar explorer. His goal was to put an end to half a century of disastrous Arctic expeditions and be the first man to reach the North Pole. When Peary first visited the polar Eskimos in 1891, he felt instantly in love with both the country and its people. For the first time in his life, he was free from the strict rules of Victorian society. Peary was to spend almost 20 years amongst the polar Eskimos, a period in which he felt most alive. During these years, he maintained a parallel life with dearly held families in both Greenland and back home in the United States. Life back in America became a constant search for funding for new expeditions.
Daraparu dama utokahait unikausarat hamaganga hidaho anotuningani. Hiudahawd unikai haranga mikki nakusuhangat inunia dakasuhangat tubinak tahormit kaya yuhamagan. Hadugdutik unikartut duannaha kangikai. Taimatut idaminik mawarhuinak pititiamata. Inuhuktut maria hyokdong nesagani. Kumukahamana kihiani unikadu bisuihatu. Aku tihak hiku mi khokrakta hangman dan khok duni dautta taman kamagina hangman. Ukaduktua tukauti uttau unikaktua tiuddu tuhangna qaika bisangaidu iddu. Nau ukaduktua tut apekutaudusik dikingarattaktuk kadoangne. Unikaktuan nahiddu ideegaan unikaktuan nahak Minik. Taunna pelaavaduk hudi piudahub amerikkadiausqaga. Ideeha unikkaarat hamagaan hohong harmigo hiudongmi timmihartoqtaqtahuartut nerhorniliktut. Ideehadu inupiduun harmut alkapunimut inuktauqatautaqattaqlussu. Unadi qudariaggaungitsoq ilaharminut maunga angertaharat hamaninga. Piulaha kipinguideratu angertauttamangimmani taavanga. hiuda haut qaddunanik ihumagduuterahamangitsut miniup inungorningata narani nauk idaanni upangaaddi angadahuddu aquhatsiaqattaqamaukkaluarni hikunialuliddaangaddi taaxaliddaangaddu auddaqattarlusik hiorluli tassatimmissat auddakaahuut nunaminnut naluhatsinnut piuda haorlaapta addaluhuoqqaarruaq inugguit akunganni inuuyamaqqahuq ukiiqattatsainnarlunilu aataharma kaalap angutigaa piuderraaq taussuma inuunerput maani addangortikkamagaa taimangali uaguddu taussumunga kinguaanguhugut taunna quyagipput ataqqihaaddugulu hiuliigatsigu kihiannili peraanguamik miningmik alarhanneeqqaninga kinguaanguhugut huli malerhorneqautigipput aperiaqaaqalerluta taimeeliorramaninga qalaherruup tikingninganut taunna pittiutaulinginnerru
tassa piuli aawani aaqaaraartunga uniperaanga mihinnissigiatigu piuli eqqaamalaraaqaaraarmak tassa aksaartanna uertaarutiqattaajuunga aukku tassaniikkalaartunga peranga ona humiginnagaahutut ihidduarnero xamookku taimammanuna mini qamuun annerpakkuarangami huna xamu pularpakkuarannarna aamit taimanilu ukua uppaheparaatortarmata akiniaqattaunera ukua huli taimanga miniu puuyorhamangitsuumi tamakkaarassa pissutaaplisik tassani toqotsiaraaqarrama
pihamahunit peqqihaluami unikkaaraanni tassa ammarahadduna ammaqalunniit unikkaariha ilaanni peqqihalaatsiartaaqaayuktoq taimaa kihanni ilihaaneqayanga hiorluttao miniu piuliddu unikkaarinaqaattarningan taimaatto.
In order to finance his expeditions, Peary wrote books, held lectures, and collected anthropological material for his main sponsor, the Museum of Natural History in New York. On one of his first expeditions, Peary discovered the largest meteorite stone known on Earth. He then realized that his financial struggle could be solved if only he managed to bring it back and sell it in America. For 2 years, he struggled to get the 90-ton heavy iron stone off the permafrost and on board his ship.
Uddoisap ana hiuderharma inuhuit hidaharna pingoqqaarmat havigamiktut naqqugamiktuddu atoqattalerramagaan piuderru inuhuit heqquutiggittuit umiarharminut uhiliutissikkarramagaa inuhuittaaq taakkua akunganniittoq miniup angutaa qihu
ima inuhuiakon duduarlui inuuhorruugami piulerra qanu inuoria hihiorluhuugami taunnapalu ihiirhaaqattaleqanera minipalu artorra ilikkarraorru ihimaliuleqanerra oqqagaagiuki angajoqqaangi amerikkamut atuariartussaaq taunna Minik angajoqqaani peqatiillugi
hio tamakkua taimaannerrut naluunneramalerakkuit minikku angutaalu qihuk inuhuitu taavunga auddartumerngit maliggamagikka qaddunaarrit nunarraangannut taavunga tammarviannut Uddoissap ana New Yorkimut ikaarutilormassuk qihuk ernilu Minik Inuhuiddu peqatitik hihamat ikaaqataullerrut. Imarpikkuulerngungginnamik ajoqlualerigaat umiarraartorner. Kiihattua portuktorharmik anorhaalittaraangat uddorsap anaata inuhuanganut pihauni heeqattalerihut auttaartruumikku taanna.
The Hope was towed in to Brooklyn Navy Yard early on the morning of October the 1st, 1897. During the first day, thousands of curious visitors paid 25 cents in admission by the dock gate. The newspapers reported enthusiastically about the little brown men in fur clothes who were suffering in the unusually strong heat wave. The men from the Museum of National History were excited but shocked by the commotion. They had expected one Eskimo at the most, but since they hadn't heard from Peary for a long time, they were not even sure about that. Now, they suddenly had a band of 6 Eskimos.
Tikeriungu Amerikamut, ayo, iddohuahangu paugaha, indahu. Paua haha inuhuingu umiangitohotai madahun tai takung halqattartoingu tamaparung mikatinga parutidane isqe unishinnaruti inuhuingu te imadiortor qamussingu ingertartartoy qamussingu uniddarangame inuhuihertarnartartut Adungudarangu Padaqartartara ako Pidudangan Angalaqangiagu Bishadara Ayo Unishinnaranha Kianigo Aksha Imadi Pahot Nitatu Idiyamami Ingel the new Tunga Kiaguta Hiotrusu.
Dia hang dekat petang dah tak di situ mata bir. Itu hak itu dah tahu yang dia. Ini hakui. Oh ni saya mai pada aku yang apa. Cak. Hai kamu. Anu saya apa.
Take a look at the room, make sure everything's okay. Come back and I'll check you in. Okay?
Katahugahingmiut inuhuit inihhannik ivaqtarruni. Taakkua uddoqulit umiarhaarmiittariaqaqanerrut. Utaqqaningannilu udduni taakkunani qaddunaat 30,000 angudduit umiarhaarmut ikaarnerrut takunngariartugit ikaarnermingni akiliutaqattainarlutik. Taakkualu inunguit kiiha katarhuahiussiarmut iniggarreriait Amerikkarmiut ingortitap uqaluktuarihauningani katarhuahiussianganu American Museum of Natural History mun qaliangani khaddaaluartut kiakpagguaqattaleranga ataanut niktertumut piamaqahut inugguittu taakkua ilihamatut ilinniartuittu ikiulerai katarhuahiussiarmi maanga katarhugainni
And most of that work was done up in this laboratory right next to where they were living. Some of it was done in Dr. Boaz's house, which was on 82nd Street.
Okay.
We're on 77th Street now. So just a few blocks over, there was an apartment where I understand some of that research was done.
Okay.
The intention of 19th century scholarship in natural history museums was to understand the condition of all humanity. It wasn't just enough to understand where, say, Victorian England came from. In a period of colonialism, as Australia and Africa and the Americas and Asia were being explored, the world needed to know how all of these races of humanity fit in together. Major empires were being set up around the world, and they had to understand what the natural order was. So there was this huge thirst. And the thinking was, the more we can understand about the way things really are out there in the world, and the better science we can do, the better world we're going to run in the 19th century. To be a good natural history museum, you were studying nature in its broad sense, and that included studying anthropology, the study of people. And in the 19th century, the study of people revolved heavily around the study of races and how they came to be, and the way you studied races was by studying skulls. And there were just not enough skulls to go around. So as major museums all over this country, and actually in Europe as well, were getting going, they would send out expeditions to get skulls however they could. So there were a number of episodes of scientific expeditions going out, many of them under false pretenses, and trying to bring back the human skeletal material that they could. There was quite a market. In the late 19th century, a good human skull would bring $5. A good human skeleton would bring $20. That's big dollars. So we even see in the early history of anthropology, anthropologists whose main interest is in symbolism or in language or in kinship or in social organization, actually financing their scientific expeditions by collecting the skulls and skeletons in the villages that they were studying to bring back and sell either on the black market or openly to museums in order to finance the expeditions. That's really one of the early chapters in the history of anthropology in this country.
Even Peary collected skulls and skeletons for the museum. He later claimed to a New York Times journalist that he had actually been friends with several of the Eskimos whose bones he had brought back with him to the museum. In the belief that indigenous cultures were doomed to disappear, anthropologists, in a race against time, tried to collect and bring back as much as they could to the museums. One of the scientists that worked at the museum was Franz Boas, who would later be regarded as the father of American anthropology.
Franz Boas came to work at the American Museum in the 1890s, and he had done field work with the Central Eskimo, and he had some ideas that were new, that were different from 19th century ideas, and he was really interested in pursuing the Eskimo research to the extent that he could. So he came up with the idea that if we could, instead of send the anthropologists out to the remote corners of the world to study people, would it be possible to bring people into New York where they could work with anthropologists and the knowledge could be saved? So that, as I understand, is why Boas approached Peary and asked him, would it be possible for you to bring some of the Eskimo people who are working with you anyway in Greenland to overwinter 1 year and stay at the museum, work with my students, record the language and whatnot, and then go back home.
Boas was not a newcomer in the field. It had been his job to create the so-called ethnographic zoo at the Chicago World Fair of 1893, set up to celebrate the 400th anniversary of Columbus. His task was to bring native people from all over the world and create an environment where they could perform and play out their culture. The museum later tried a similar venture when they placed a pygmy in the Bronx Zoo. He shared a cage with an orangutan.
Nunahhop takungartap inoqqaangit nuannaartut takungartinneq nuanninguaddaagaan uddutsinnili taimaa haqqummiinneq pissuiggami huungittutut pigaat katerrugaahivit pissuhiminertik nikainittoq pissutiuhaaramikku inuit inuuhauhiat nutaa kihiat takutittama naugauna hiulitta ileqquat huli takkaluaatput addangortingidduu taimaa katerrugaahivit ileqquallaarniarlutik ingahiassihut uqaluktuarihaunnerit pingaarrinnaahut tammaaluktinngikkunikki iliarnaunnerrikkarrinnaaqarait New Yorkip hidainnerraanga ussikkорруммат инуггуит хапилермигаат наппаалалерlutik миниуп ангутаа қиук ипуматтуни ператталерсу пуахаарнилу қахилиеқатталерлуит хакиактулерами Hudson Riveraidu apilormat qihuk kamattakkaluartoq hikugiarpat aquilumniarluni ayorde nuannaayagdingninguanga taima miniup angunni neriurruraa ileqqumittut iliverniarlugu niaqqumana akuttuunik qinninniarat angutaata pigaa tassagooqtarnaa aniguiniarma tassanga nunaminuttu uterluni qihuk taimaa hiuttiuttuni tuquhummiu Minik New Yorkimut auttaqqayangittaalaaraamini ukiu hiuliani arnaaruteqqahu taimak inuktunguvaluktu miniuttu angunni katerrugaahivigguup nauttiiviani ilivileraa katerrugaahivigmi hulihut ilaannik ikiortilerluni ilihereeramik inugguit ittuluktaata minik qimingniarluupilerru taimani taimaa hiulerrakka ileqqoqarneramik peraaq huli akunnakduni ilaarukkaangat taimaaliorаттaqanerrut inuuniarneq taimani imainnaungingman taimaaliorquhingittutik katerrugaahivigmi hulihut ilaata William Wallace tiguaraa ernerriarittugulu miniu amerikkarmiutut peruartornillaa ilihamatuut malingnau biissattuu iluatitaggamitut oqutiittuarramagaat inuk peraa qaddunaat inuuhauhiannut tuttuarrauhinnaunerroq takuyamagamikku minik Wallace-ikkunniilerroqtu Bronximi ilangi inugguit angumalerikkarluarrannarnutik nappaammik toqualerrat алеқангуани таймаа авиа такоққиккаттангеригаа унгайттуартугуаан
Even if the dying Eskimos were a serious drawback for the museum, they offered a unique opportunity for study. A public battle about the ownership of the body raged between the hospital and the museum, even before Kihuk was actually dead. Finally, an agreement was reached, stating that the museum would get the skeleton and the hospital the tissue and organs. In the twilight, a piece of log wrapped in Kehook's clothes was buried in the museum garden. Behind Minik's back, Kehook's body was then taken away for preparation. The museum tried on countless occasions to ask Peary for help with the sick Eskimos, but he was always too busy raising funds for his upcoming expedition and never replied. Early the next summer, he returned to Greenland again. He stayed on this occasion for 3 years, exploring the northern coast in an effort to find a land bridge to the North Pole. During this expedition, Peary discovered that there was no land at the top of the world. This meant that the North Pole was only reachable by way of its ice cap.
Going way back in time, and you have these almost pre-mapped prior to 1500, and there was great concept of how could the world be balanced? Why wouldn't it spin out of control if the land masses were not equal? Again, when they found the Antarctic continent, and they said, well, there must be a counterweight at the North Pole. But of course, you did have fringe explorations up there and the attempts to find the Northwest Passage, and they kept going further and further north. But again, as far as the Arctic Ocean, Peary was obviously the first man to be successfully going all the limit to the point of reaching the North Pole itself. Oh, I think there's no doubt about the importance of Peary in American history. I think he was driven by his desire to become famous. I think that was the overriding factor in his mind. But again, to protect that concept is what he suffered, the loss of his toes and the hardships that he suffered. I certainly would not have wanted to live the life that he did in accomplishing that trek.
I am repeatedly asked, what is the charm of the Arctic region? Why is it that a man who once goes north is anxious to go again? The charm of the Arctic is the appeal of the primeval world to the primeval man, stirring the last drops of the blood of the cavemen in our veins. It is the physical lust of struggling with and overcoming the sternest natural obstacles on the face of the globe. And no live man, no man with red blood in his veins, ever goes north, but what returning, he goes again if possible.
One of the interesting facets of early exploration is that very few explorers ever utilized the expertise of the Inuit. Peary, his first year in the Arctic, he wintered over. And what he did was to attempt to learn all he could from the Inuit about their clothing, their mode of travel. It always sort of intrigued me. We have downstairs, we have one of Peary's sleds. And over the years, we've had many Arctic explorers who think they are so brilliant they design their own sleds. And of course, the sea ice is very hard, and metal fittings at that temperature will fracture. And they always went back to Kanak and got the genuine article to make their treks up over the sea ice to the north.
Inukhuit idariukkaat idduikkinermiktu ilinniartittuu qimmerhaartikkamikulu aipangliaqatiqattaleраат kapertagghiittu ilaanni amaawa aatarhaarma arnaa aleqahit hangmiharilera ernerharviittuulumarlungnik aipaassa aatarhara kaala
aanaga piurerrongu aitqattaqaga ivalu unikkaqqara taayagu aatikkallarlugu uqqartipparruaqattaqqa unanaartutsiaaleqangamiuammaqa aittutoqannaaqqa qugagungnu tassu uiminittupalu piurerromi
uilipalu pilerangamiu Minik nuliaqangitseqquulluni tikеqqалерагами таанна Auna erererereramiu kukkuuruanerro piuti. Uerrarmeertippaguaralugu. Nuannerduangineraluni ammaataaya qanorlikia. Naammakduangikkalu. Unga tidiortartuguna qalatseqqaangum. Nanniorniartunguttiari.
Uqaaqquddamma qanorlikia. Ihiyutsuun hiddunaakkamma.
Atalukeetu takusseertarneri.
Alkayaqqaalaaitta.
Tuhaahunga unikkaanga una eqqaamat dooriga imaapeqqammat unikkaaqamammat. Peraavalu daalaaramigo anaanani kanguuqteqattartugamiuk nuannaangippuaqattamaarruaq qaamahapalungni idingahapalungni imaat nuyali paluugami inugguit kanguhaartutut peqattartummassuk anaanani uerragaaninga tassuuna errarteqattartummassuk nakleeqattartugamiuor nuannaangippuaqattamaarruaq kidaarpaggaaqamaarruaq nappaqamaarruq lunilu niaqovalaago meqqoqaarneeqangami kidaarpaggaaqangami meqqutialeriorernertuni тассагу киссаатеқартаат лахаанга питеқалу илуархаат лахамаакторо
киен сриккиинарпаггаагама инуггима пиэккумоорруга меққорторхоққаррунга авагаактак имаамакааниуккалунни qoliarramalukkaakka meqqortorrumuni сриккиинаррит неэққарруанга нанооху сриккиинаррагат meqqoqarneralunniaqarneqqajaralunga uani nuiaqarramaunga ima auppillaartiihuni ima hiliktiihungu lutikkatinga tassa aattattaat eqqameequtikka uggornaattakkalaakka
Bronximi waalassikkunniittuni Minik Amerikkarmiut assiittuit peoraartulerra.
I am following the trail back to 1900 to find a little Eskimo boy who was adopted by William Wallace long time ago. He used to live around here. So I'm trying to find the old house, but I guess...
Old house from Nelson?
Yeah.
They're all torn down. These are all new houses.
Okay.
Now there's an old house over here. Those are old houses, and up the block, you go up this hill, those are old houses over here.
18 and some years.
Right.
That tear it down. They put all new building.
Right. Okay.
So that's destroyed already. You're never going to find that little house that you're talking about. Never, because
not even the place.
The place. Look. Sometimes they change even the place.
Avihidiortut assitiihuttu aahit Minik alapangartailigaat nunat takongartat inuqqaangat nunami hivuarramahumi peoriartorninga malinnaappiamattuut.
What about my life? What about my life? What about his life? What about his life?
Peqaqassaamia mangaluqquartartorruugaat. Giakhriunnereartormaarruga akagiaiffeqqaarruga tamakkaqallunaaukkuit. Akigaifeqqaarruga. Ihimaliorluartaaggala. Tilluutitaallaamalala hunhatilluqorpaqortorniuserikka. En meni uge hanat dun chik do to tahama mga tawa do. Yeah. Chik do ya hama okay en me chik do ka pa ta ya mi. Ida ayo mi ga ida ka chik ya chik do pa ka ta ta. Mga tayo nita ayo mutta.
Boaz was interested in studying Eskimo research. When he went out into the field, he was told that Eskimos are living fossils. And this was a time where the entire history of the world was viewed in terms of cultural stages. There were savages, and there were barbarians, and then there were civilized people, and you didn't cross over that line easily at all. So if the Eskimo people were considered to be living fossils from an Ice Age time, living out a life way that was almost extinct, they had zero potential to become civilized. Boaz looked at it differently. He thought the environment had a tremendous impact on the way in which people grew up and behaved. So Boaz would argue you could take an Eskimo child, move them to Peking, and they would end up speaking fluent Mandarin. So what he was trying to do was take Eskimo people, because they are such a dramatic exception and such a great difference. He thought if he could show that they were a functioning society working within the limits of a very difficult environment, he could not only develop his ideas about the role of race and how that fit in with language and culture, but he could also completely eradicate this notion of stages in human development.
Turn right.
Temakia. New York awang nani Catskills Mountains mi. Miniup ang utihianga William Wallace. Na tiwiling mi. Ikduhilqa. Tasaniyo miniup peraunini iqaya yukhamaga nuan hami.
It was said that when they came to this country, their manners weren't too good, and called him a little savage because he would just take his hands and stuff the food in his mouth and then cut it off with a knife. It took 6 months, and he turned out to be a very polite little boy. And he was a good friend of the Wallace's son. He did go to Sunday school, and he did learn his prayers. He didn't take it too seriously, though. He would start a prayer at the bottom of the stairs so that when he got to the top of the stairs, he could climb right in bed.
Minik went to Sunday school here, and he sang in his native language to the whole congregation right here. And this is the Sunday school attendance book. I marked the places I found him. There's a lot of kids going to the school here. But this is for 1898.
1898.
Right here. Class number 6, Mrs. Lamont is the teacher. There's Minnie Wallace on the bottom.
Right. So he had already Wallace's name.
Yeah, by 1898, he's already here with the Wallace name.
So he was here until...
He's here every day except for last 2 weeks of August. Could have been sick again. Or maybe back down in New York.
Wallace had built up a mini empire in Loyersville and became known as a generous philanthropist. He bought several farms, started a dairy plant, which supported the cities down south with fresh milk and butter. On his summer house, Cold Spring Farm, he ran a private side business where he obtained dead or dying circus animals, the remains of which were prepared, then sold to the museum.
That's funny. When I first moved into this community 20 years ago, The first two things locals told me that there's an elephant in the spring, which may or may not be true. There certainly was an elephant in the spring at one time. And that the house over here, that it was really haunted, and it was haunted by Eskimos.
And there was one night years ago, it was only a year or two after purchasing the house and moving here, that I heard what sounded very clearly to me, a voice. It was a calm evening, and it appeared to be saying "mommy" to me, was what it sounded like. Very brief, but very distinct and very unnerving, because I don't personally believe in ghosts and haven't had any experiences like that, but I'll say quite honestly that I did hear something, and it was very out of the ordinary. Well, I guess they used to use museum specimens, different animals. I've heard of elephants and things like that. Mm-hmm. But then, as the story's told, Minik's father was also, the bones were cleaned here too. Much to Minik's surprise later in life, right? My understanding from the history that this is somewhere in the vicinity is where they would bring the bones from the city for the museum, mm-hmm. and they would heat them with, again, what I heard, a steam plant, and then they would dose them in the cold water and scrape the meat off to clean the bones for display.
I can see that in this book that he has taken the brain of Ryuk. It could be among the collections he had.
It's very possible. The standard process then was to preserve brains so that they could then be studied and measured in the future. And Hrdlička was actually fascinated, even obsessed, with the techniques of how to preserve human brains. So he actually wrote one 300-page manual that's all about exactly what kind of formaldehyde you should use and how much of it and what size jar you should use and how long the specimen, as they called these brains, would be preserved. So I can't imagine that they would have destroyed the brain. I imagine that it must have been saved somewhere.
Checked up on the skull, on the brain business. We don't have any brains from Greenland in the collection at all. Hrdlička didn't start working for the Smithsonian as a staff member until 1910, but he was on the outside and working, on contracts and doing a few things. But we think he went up to New York City to look at this material. So he came into anthropology from schizophrenia studies, and so there's a scientific reason that he started getting interested in.
Are you the brain collector?
No. This collection stopped actually in the 1940s. It was collected over nearly 100 years, I think, by a series of Cornell professors. The last one was picked up in, I guess, 1944, and since then it's been stored in various places. Okay. And they're in various conditions. Some are in better condition than others. Different people for different times stored them in different chemicals, some of which turned out to not be very good for keeping them.
So is there any possibility to find some brains of Eskimos here?
Here? I'm not sure. Many years ago, one of the earlier curators of the collection lost the table that matches the histories to which brains they are. So many of these brains that don't have names on them, we don't know who they are, but we have the histories of everyone that was ever part of the brain collection. So we have cards with all the various histories, and we can certainly look through them.
Okay.
Find you a place to sit down, I suppose.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so we have, geez. It's not just medical doctors that have bad handwriting.
German comedian. Insane. Naturalist, surely collection. Qihub qaaha naneqqayanngittuarriya. Qaahanik ilihamatortipiska toqummat. Qaahaqparparpaggiit kiungusihuvinu qimataaqqagai. Qitonganguanga talu taaya qanorpiaartui naloqqagai. Son and grandson of scientist. Tamaiha ihinnarramaguhaarai. Ammaattauanga ihinnarmayagalaarikka. Taima qarattea qanorpeqqahut nalunarahut. I like to look at some skulls.
Alrighty.
Is it real skulls over there?
Yes.
How much does it cost?
From about $300 to about $1,000, mostly depending on how many teeth they have.
And where are they from?
Different places. We get them from medical supply companies. These days, they're very difficult to obtain. We buy antique ones.
What kind of nationalities are they?
Most of them are from Asia.
Do you have some Eskimo skulls?
No.
No? Indian skulls?
No.
Native American skull, I mean? No. If I want to get something like this, what can I do? Where can you get it?
I have no idea.
You have no idea?
I think that Native American remains are protected under the law. I don't think you can buy and sell them.
This baby up there, is it real or?
Yes.
Is a, what's that?
It's a human infant skeleton or a fetal skeleton. They were prepared in France. We bought a number of them from a doctor. We sell them for about $5,000 each. Fetus is hard to come by. Certainly they don't die in as many numbers as adults. Or at least we like to hope not. This one is standing in what's called the anatomical position. We also have one in the front window that's set in the fetal position.
Eqqisihamanartuartumi nunainnarmi inuugami miniu huoqtaliktaaya ariutsihamaga ukiu pingahangorramalerruttu aattataima hilarraaga torluttummermiu waalassip nulianga toqu kingungalu waalas ahineqalertuni katerruaahuigguup aningaahainik atornertuihamagutu huliap mihiggiornerarningani waalassi taima unaarutivaluktu Minik angutihianilu iniggiat mikeqqihat itaannut manhaatannimittuma nuuttaajaqalertuti
I really don't know what the relationship was between Minik and Wallace, and that's a huge mystery, and I wonder if there's any way to find this out. If Wallace never actually officially adopted him, but there must have been affection between them. I mean, they were like father and son, really. But it didn't seem to stop Wallace from exploiting this tragedy to his own end. William Wallace was a very strange and interesting character and a man of dubious ethics and morals, raised in the Five Points House of Industry in one of the worst sections of New York, and one of the worst slums probably ever to exist. And he rose to be superintendent of the museum and the protege of one of the richest men in the United States.
Minik New York kimut uteqikkami atuarnini nagaqqikkaa qiimmaaddautiha Minik. Huddudia hariulermatalu William Wallace formaannitut hulilerro. Idaannilu Miniu mikiuqattaraa. Inatiuaniktu ukiuqalerami Manhattan Collegemi ilinniartuulertuni. Ilinniakkaminik paayaggarriortuni katerhugaayuissiartikeqqaarami nayuaminerti ornissaraa iliamaaggarrior
Nivingaarrui tamaani haanertugui. Avanigai tuoleriga teqeqqumi inuu haunga tamavittuarraarmi nivingaho tamalluaginnarmi ornissamaga goortaavunga aipaggaani takoqqiluauggalera kiihagortata hayugiartuleqisoq tupeqangami aksiorro pahipiiluteqangamiu hayu luahaulerluni tassaala atia aipaggami atia imaago ihumaliule qihummi tuulimiu hio inga qihummi ateqarpa hiorlu aipaggama uaupihungittorruagut taassuma tassatunniussa akihunaaqalugu tunniuteqqagaakateqqugaa hiingmut akihunaapilu neqalugu tuulimiu haungat.
The story that was published in one of the newspapers at the time was that Minik, as a teenager, went to the museum and found his father's skeleton in a case staring at him, you know. And I think that whole story is false. I think that story was concocted by William Wallace, and perhaps with the assistance of the newspaper reporter, as a way to embarrass the museum as much as possible. Because that didn't happen. There isn't any evidence that the skeleton was ever put on display. And knowing the museum's history, I know that it's very unlikely the skeleton would have been put on display. And the way it's described in that article with the brass joints or whatever, that the skeletons in the museum were not mounted that way, ever. They weren't mounted with brass joints. I think Wallace told Minik what had happened to his father, or Minik found out from Wallace. But Wallace, in trying to get his job back or in trying to save himself, threatened to expose what the museum had done with Minik. And so Wallace went to the papers with this horrific story about how they pretended to bury his father, but instead they buried a log with a mask on it, and instead were preparing his father's body for exhibition in the museum. Anyway, he sensationalized it, and the yellow press loved it.
Ediviet ang mayaria takunieduklu tamarmiunerra imalunnit ahuttuaginna tunniuteqqanerata ikunga uanga takuiaaria imminertunga ediviet takuyartormagiga takkuuna ayuormigo ediviet takuyartoqqaarruugaat ayo tassa neqmina lupali annuaamina annuaamini paliddu tassakihim addataqangitto.
I mean, this was a gross violation of Christian beliefs at the time. This wasn't just indigenous beliefs that were being violated, but the idea that they would take a body and dissect it and take the brain out and boil the bones so that the skeleton could be removed and installed in a collection, this was all violations of Christian belief. And New Yorkers were horrified to read about this. I mean, I think Minik genuinely, had a lot of these feelings of wanting his father's body back and was very resentful of the disrespect that the museum had shown his father's remains. But at the same time, he was grossly exploited by Wallace as a way not to help Minik, but to get back at the museum. And I think he did a lot of damage to that young Eskimo.
Inu pido katitaakhisa. Inu katitaakharuni. Dokkudo katitaakhisa. Kammakha ajornangitsa. Naqutsaajaakhangami tassa atuariartussiiqaluni. Naqutsaajaakhamakhoo akikhokhakko. Qaddunaakkuit ajannissuiqangitserruit. Tassagu oqaaqtaariseqalu. Taspididaraangannigo taakku iluaqatillaartarai imaattuti. Hulledeangaarnina tilluutiliangaarni hanaqqissaalaarattarai. Tilluutitaarpakkaaqalunile. Aksorootilluppagua akiniarpagguaqqaarruga akiniaqatirpagguaqqaarrugayo innupiloqassaarni ataatahiarraarminu pissiiqaluni naatsiivissuunga akimaqortorto naatitaussuani hunarpaggaanga pertuktarpaggaaqalu hitamiittaqquitamarraaqaaqukkuuneetarpaggaaqalu attatungu annuaalerluni kiinanimatullugu aata imaapiseria aningaahani tunin kumma toquyarokki angutisiarraani tatipiddu aningaahantaqaarniigatunerpaggaria tassakappiartorugami toquyaalerangani
Miniu angummi timaa utersinnialukkaluaraa neriorruinermihut iliveramattuu katerruaahiviuddi ajornarteria. President Roosevelt timut tittavaluktukkalua ikioqqudluni autta huattangeraluni. Kiihakipinguhungnini piulerraarmut haarigaa oqarlunilu hiuttiulluni qalaherraarmut piaarluni. Piulerraartutsarangingmat Minik ingminivaluk auttarniavalukkinnalersoq. Kiaktormiungunguarlusik uummataitsut qimakluit. Inukpaluktumi uummatilingnut uteraamalerami.
The only problem was that Peary's ship was the sole vessel going that far north. Peary was now in his mid-50s and marked by physical and emotional hardships. He knew that this was his last chance to reach the pole, and he had no wish to have Minik run around and gossip to the Eskimos about how badly they'd been treated in America. So once again, Peary turns his back on Minik and refuses Minik's request, saying that the ship is overcrowded. In the summer of 1908, Peary bids farewell to President Theodore Roosevelt and the New York Society and sets sail for his last attempt.
Minik mitaangilerami New York qimaklugu pihukduni auddavalukto taunga inugguit nalaannu Newfoundlandni angunialuktuu тассангаавангниат нунатсинну пиуггат илуатсинниалугаматтугит Канада киддерарпиати киккалуарлугулу никаллуфалунгмио авиихитту илаат Нью-Йорккимииттоқ титтарвигаа инууттуаққуссумми маани нунами қитсугнут қингминутту иттулиунгуассаппут инуухуктунгуарлунниит ину нунаминут агертаамаҳо икиорнеқ аювалуктуссук Piuderruup nuliangata Josefina Minik kiha ikiornialulernera ihumariuleramigo minik nunaminiileruni tortukulungeqqiaviani hidduu piulerharmuddu pajuktut auddalermata auhakkut 1909 miniup ikkiviigai peqataappiilertugulu Peary Relief Expedition noriorruiddunilu Amerikkamut uteqqingihannajaarluni
tässä ikakkagat outdownik hintissa. Outdahpatak hin kudannaartugu. Tässä ivangaqarta.
Kia unga hikduartorrorma qimaalernerra. Ingertauqarama igdoqaqingium peqanerra. Aningaahataangaanigo nerniuteqqaaqqa tässä uuriltituangaani. Arnarraungu pualaluaggu orneqiga imaapiteriga minitit nipterrait luaqalerra minitit minimmi atititi nittungit luaqala immangarrarlunigo angeqqaaqqa inuktaliggumi aitiaarukki aqagu uunnu piaartutit hiu aitiaarukki aqagu aku aningaakkatin unnuinniartutit ikani agilissukkikkit addami pingittuarnartutit tassa naalanniartutit aku aningaakkatin tuleqqaarrugaaka unnuussutissiani nanilunni taajaga unnueqqaarto hiiningniaartoro tiuqarraqala inukkuamartarru qiakkuuteqaluulu pikkunga imaataqaluku taajo naaluaruqarrannarga imaagu ihumaliukkala kiihaata taaja amerikkamiittuk qimmeqajunga ukiorpakkiit arnaarussariaaleriunga imaagu ihumaliullaaqqualeqa qiangu luahulluni huna iddiviarru iddivialiornarlutit iddivi iduanu puujaaraat maungalu qaana uteqqaartillu minipaluk tassa annugaaqanngittorruaq imaattupalu
maanimiuddu ajungutsiin peqattarammassuk tassa ikiorrumaga te umiarrutnaalaga ihimaqatiittugu karrimu poorlussuk noriakkittussuk
Arnarramalerlutiklugu umiarrunaalagaata puungerramaga arnarramalerangami tassa maunga uteqaluni puuiqqamaarruuga maanimiga uqaluktut ajortorruuga maanimiuta uqalunga turangulluniga arnarramaarruugami naluhunguqalu maanimiuta uqalunna inu neriaggaataida nerna ajorlugu eqqeqquartuluqattaulluni taima inuulualuugginguaqanerra
miniup amerikkami inuunini haddulugduni unikkaaleraangagu inukkuit peeqattavaluggaраат qaddunaarriddi piliarraangit qaqqarriit innaarruliarriit manhattanimiittut qamussuangittu qimmeqartaajaqanngitsorruit unikkaaleraangagit upperimagunneeqattarnussuk inuuluqatiamagunneeqalugu haddulugnihiittussuk
After over 20 years of struggle, Peary reached his goal. In his diary, he writes to his wife, "Made good at last. The pole is mine." For Peary, this signaled the end to his lifelong love affair with the Arctic. As his health deteriorated and Josephine, his wife, refused to let him return, he was never again to live the simple life, never again to see his Eskimo wife or his two sons, Kali and Samik. During the final period of his life, Peary sat isolated in his home on Eagle Island. Even though he was recognized by both the House of Congress and the scientific world, his achievement to have reached the North Pole was constantly put into question, a suspicion which would cast a shadow over the final part of his life.
Good to see you. You look good. I came here when I was 2 weeks old. And I spent every summer here for 20 years. I was only about 20 months old when he died, so I don't have any memories of him personally. But I was raised by his wife and his daughter. And his personality, he had a very strong personality, as you can imagine. And that came through in a very positive way for me. So I feel that I know him, and you can feel him here. We knew, although it was never discussed, but we knew that that had been a son born up there. We didn't know. I didn't know at that time that there were two. But it was never talked about. Which is why when both my mother and my grandmother were gone and could no longer be hurt by this, that I said, "Hey, I've got a family up there," and I went up and saw them and immediately felt the kinship.
Ukiut idanni pingortitap uqaluktuarihauningani katerrugaahivik maani angalatittilermat Minik ikiortaajamaqqahoq qimukkerrauttunilu uqaluktaajamattuni ayugormi amerikkarmiut iserterviigai ittoqatiilertuittu katerrugaahivigguullu autta miningmik tikiutsitsihumernguk ulihorideraa akikkarriaqartittugu
ihumaliuqattaleria imaapiteriaagoo uuta тассамаанеқиуктарангитсерра идду америккамут утераттарлунга киллуиартунгорлунга орпассиарни таава қиуккуит аксерруаррааваккуа америкками орпитталиссиа қиукталиссиа аксерруаррааваккуа америкками утераттарлунга умиаррилаанни кигалларлунга иллухханни аилератарниартунга идулиорниалеқигуу уутахаорпеққага ihumaliortuvaluugami аксарраа иллуккартараматтуни америккаминга америккамут утерамаа
ангалаартусикту америккамут утилермата миниуп иккивигай икаақатилертуидду
Four months after Minik's return to America, he applies for American citizenship. He has now taken his former enemy Peary's name, Minik Peary Wallace, describing himself as a white man.
Auttaqqik aahit Minik avangnamut auddavalukto kanataddu kidderarviata qanitaani iddoqarvinguamut Pittsburghmut pidduni tassani orpikpaggaarni kidduiartungorto takorluukkami akiggaannik katernialuktuni.
He came here from Boston. They used to go to Boston and hire possibly immigrants and like that to come and work in the woods. And that's how he happened to come to Pittsburgh. You know, in this area, I think most people were all treated the same. There were a lot of different nationalities that came here to work. Afton was a bachelor, lived with his mother and father. And they became close friends, he and Minik, and I think they treated him just like one of the family. But when the flu epidemic hit, that was it.
Well, what I've heard was good. My father spoke well of him. He didn't know him too well, but he'd worked in the woods with him. But he was a good friend of Afton, and Afton took him home when he was sick. And he died there at Fred Hall. This is the house where Mamie Wallace died, spent his last few days. And the headstone was bought by Aston Hall. He left money to his great-nephew. If there was money left after he died, he wanted his great-nephew to put in a marker for him. Right. And his nephew got the stone, and the nephew and I put it in. Yes, Mamie Wallace is right there.
Right here. Right. Ah yeah ha yeah yeah ah yeah ha yeah yeah ah yeah yeah hey no na mi no pende 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 hey ah yeah yeah hey ah yeah ha yeah yeah
tässä pitää auttu jahduni toko parunnamme. Mini paruk taavani toko karuni. Pitää auttu jahtu haaralluni toko karuni Amerikkami. Tässä on kyllä karuni. Mini.
Inuninga takiunga huna takuhakhawa. Idaqwa aquinarmikdu atsifsauna. Unikkaartuumut tammaajaqtortumut eqqaissutit. Qalaherraarnialungnerru inungni nalittu aattalu inugguit ingmingnik nunaqarnutik pillaannik pavanganakkartup tunissutip havilluup piddiutauningani hiorluliassa piddiuti tamakkua puyurramagiu eqqatsiarnaqattaqluiddi unikkaartuatu pihumangi qammuuna kissaallaktitsiginnaahun aattali atuaggainartut naammaittarnuta atukkavu ikiornialukkaluarluta tamakkua taimaa eqqagaluarmata Hidahait atautsumortinniarnillat piukkuaviaarangikkia. Hidahaq taimaattumma assiingissuteqarmat taimaattariaqarlunilu. Nanikkaluarmalunniit inunga imminik inuunilit. Addat inuuninganni inuunerangitsoq inuunerarnaarangitsoqlu. Fahiya ateqarlunga angiyoqqaangma atsiussaanni hiussumi taunnaahungalu addaangitsoq